I'd like to welcome all of you here to this special episode of the History Book Club. My name is Ann Waltner, and I'm chair of the History Department. Before we get going, I would like to be sure that you know this session is being recorded. If you would prefer not to be recorded, you may simply turn your video off. This is a special episode of the History Book Club. It is in collaboration with the journal Church History. It is a discussion of John Butler's wonderful new book, God in Gotham. And we will proceed with a panel discussion, which will then be followed by a response that John will make, and then there will be a question and answer session. If there are any technological glitches, and probably as all of us have been spending many hours a week on Zoom, there do sometimes happen to be technological glitches. My colleague Clayton Jelinek will step in and save the day. He's already, he's muted, but he waved. He's there. So I think we're in great shape. If you have questions, probably the most efficient way of getting your questions to us is by posting them on the chat, and then we'll respond to them. So at this point, I think what I'd like to do is introduce John McGreevy, who will moderate this session. He's a professor at Notre Dame. He is a former dean of the College of Arts and Letters at Notre Dame. And he also has served as an associate editor of the journal Church History, Studies in Christianity and Culture, which is a co-sponsor of this night's event. So John, I'll turn the floor over to you at this point.
Thanks, Ann, and thanks to Clayton and Ann from the University of Minnesota for their great work, and especially to Andrea Stirk from the American Society of Church History, who put together this event. We're in for a treat tonight. We have a spectacular panel to talk about a most important book. I'm going to introduce the panelists. They're each going to speak for 10 minutes, and then John Butler will give a response. And then we're going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and I'll try and consolidate questions and get all the panelists as well as John to jump into what we think should be a lively and productive conversation for an hour and a half. So our panelists. The first panelist will be Wallace Best. Wallace is the Hughes Roger Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton. He's the author of 2 books. The first, Passionately Human, No Less Divine, Religion and Culture in Black Chicago, 1915 to 1952. And the second, Langston's Salvation, American Religion and the Bard of Harlem, winner of the 2018 Award for Excellence in the Study of Religion. Second panelist will be Deborah Dash Moore. She's the former director of the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and the Frederick G. L. Hootwell Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. She's the author of a number of books and many articles in American Jewish history and beyond. I won't try and list them, but I'll note that she's the editor and guiding visionary for a 3-volume history of Jews in the city of New York, City of Promises, A History of the Jews of New York, and the editor-in-chief of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, a remarkable anthology of Jewish literature, artwork, and artifacts that's been published by Yale University Press. The third panelist will be my much admired colleague, Tom Tweed, who's the Harold and Martha Welch Professor of American Studies and Professor of History at Notre Dame. Tweed's authored or edited 6 books, including The American Encounter with Buddhism, 1844 to 1912, Our Lady of the Exile, Diasporic Religion at a Cuban Catholic Shrine in Miami, and many others, including a new volume in the Oxford Short History series on religion. He is the former president of the American Academy of Religion and is now writing a 1-volume history of religion in the lands that became the United States. And the man of the hour is John Butler, Howard Lamar Professor Emeritus of American Studies, History and Religious Studies at Yale, and he served as Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Yale, as well as chair of the Departments of History and chair of the Department of American Studies. John grew up in rural Minnesota and earned his BA and PhD from our host institution, the University of Minnesota, from which he has also received an honorary degree. His several books include The Huguenots in America, A Refugee People in a New World Society, Awash in a Sea of Faith, Christianizing the American People, and Becoming America, The Revolution Before 1776, and of course, this evening's topic, God in Gotham. Unusually, John is almost as well known for his unusually incisive, wonderfully contrarian articles and reviews of the literature as he is for his very distinguished monographs. So I think that should give us wonderful anticipation of the conversation we'll have this evening. He is now, as I noted, completed God in Gotham, which in a one-sentence summary is about religion in Manhattan from the Gilded Age to the Kennedy election of 1960, and is the subject of our forum this evening. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wallace, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, John, and hello, everyone. John Butler's God in Gotham, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan, affirms what historians of religion have long known and some urban historians have begun to discover, that few things in American history have survived so well as religion. Political moments and social movements have come and gone, fashions have fallen out of favor, fads have faded, but that thing which we call religion, however defined, theologically, experientially, or institutionally, has survived, even thrived, particularly in American cities, and perhaps most particularly in America's largest city, New York. Modern American society has not become so secularized as to replace religion, nor has modernity secured religion's demise. The key questions are, what accounts for the resiliency of religion in the face of modernity, and how has anyone ever thought otherwise? Using Manhattan as a representative case study, Butler answers these questions with astounding clarity and insight. God in Gotham begins with a discussion of the perceived antagonism between urban space and religious faith. As Butler discusses, cities have long been widely viewed as metropolitan dens of sin and vice, morally bankrupt and spiritually corrupt forces in the lives of their inhabitants. No city has sustained the association between sin and the city more emphatically than New York. From the late 19th century throughout the 20th, ministers and moral reformers have railed against what they believe to be the evilest city in the world, starting perhaps with Samuel Lane Loomis's 1887 book, Modern Cities and Their Religious Problem. And for decades, other ministers would follow his example and further expand upon these depictions of the city. The evangelist showman Billy Sunday often thundered about the evil that was New York, decrying in 1915, "There is little hope that the Lord ever will be able to save such a hellhole as New York." Another evangelist named Billy stated pretty much the same thing over 40 years later. The common depiction of New York City as particularly sinful animated Billy Graham's motivation for his first evangelical crusade in the city in 1957. Writing in his personal diary just days before the launching of the crusade at Madison Square Garden, Graham proclaimed, "I know that we're going to one of the strongholds of Satan." With God in Gotham, Butler vividly and convincingly undermines this association between sin and the city, showing that it has never had much merit, and certainly not from 1880 to 1960. Rather, he begins with a controlling question about a very different New York City. How did religion confront the challenge of modernity in the most prominent borough of what by 1925 was the world's largest city? It was not the city of sin Loomis and others had described. Rather, New York was, as Butler has proclaimed, a sacred modern city where many of the markers of modern religion were laid down. As he states, far from a casualty of the modern, religion in Manhattan became quintessentially modern. It was as much institutional and bureaucratic as theological, and it was fueled by international and domestic migration well into the 1930s. It was a sacred modern city for many Jews, Catholics, and Protestants who embraced modern organization, institutional structure, and modes of outreach. Employing modern methods and the materials of modernity, radio, advertising, and architecture, the churches and synagogues of New York transformed themselves and the meaning of religious practices in the city. Butler reveals those transformations in three principal areas: institutions, sacred space, and religious activism. Perhaps the most intriguing and contributive chapter in the book is chapter 2, Organizing God, where Butler revives institutional history, acknowledging that some scholars had come to see it as unsexy and boring. Butler re-elevates the institutional approach to religious history to the level of importance it should never have lost. He shows that religion in New York was fundamentally institutional, and that these institutions were the instruments through which most New Yorkers, most Americans, approached God. Although he is careful to show important differences in organizational forms and institutional priorities between the city's Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, all of the city's principal religious groups deepened their traditional, ritual, theological, and spiritual identities by committing to institutional orders and employing modernity in their service, he contends. Butler also shows how sacred space in New York was a deliberate construction based on social needs and the shape of the built environment. Echoing the assertions of sociologist of religion Robert Wuthnow, Butler understands the sacred as a production of human action, allowing anything and any place to become sacred space, from a barber shop to a subway car to a classified ad, as it linked faith to the press of modern life. As a scholar of migration, this construction of sacred space caught my attention as it resonated with my own findings about the construction of sacred space in Chicago, which was similarly wide open. The many chevras of New York reminded me of the hundreds of storefront churches of Chicago popping up in that city during the same time period. And similar to Chicago, by the 1940s, religion of nearly incomprehensible variety was everywhere in Manhattan, stuffed visually, aurally, and tactilely into the metropolitan landscape and the minds of those who called it home. Butler shows that even the streets became sacred spaces, declaring that the streets that brought worshipers to sanctuaries and storefronts offered equal opportunities for sacralization. The third area of transformation relates to the other two in significant ways, but is just as significant on its own. Butler has filled his book with a wide array of religious actors and their religious actions in New York City, often working within institutional contexts and sometimes not. These actors radically shape the religious landscape and the meaning of religious work in the city, while employing, not avoiding, the tools of modernity. And in Butler's view, this level of religious work eclipsed that which was happening anyplace else in America. As he states, between the 1920s and the 1960s, Manhattan stimulated an outpouring of individual and institutional religious creativity unsurpassed in any other 20th century American locale, rural or urban. Throughout the borough of Manhattan, from Harlem to the Lower East Side, people such as Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and Jr., Reinhold Niebuhr, Norman Vincent Peale, and Dorothy Day helped to turn New York City into a veritable center of American religion. And they did it in awareness of, but not in cooperation with one another. As Butler concludes, together, yet without even a hint of coordination or collective intent, they fostered passionate new religious visions amid the bustle of the world's largest city. From the allegedly inhospitable spiritual environment, they changed what God and religious life meant to millions of people. God in Gotham is the first book of its kind. While admittedly not a comprehensive account of religion in New York, it is nonetheless a sweeping history of Judeo-Christianity in the city, told as one coherent yet multifaceted story, rather than merely a part of the larger story of New York. John Butler has achieved something astounding, and his work will likely pave the way for others, for as he concedes, there is so much more to say. and those works will doubtlessly find some basis in Butler's key claims regarding the construction of modern religion and the interplay rather than alleged antagonism between religion, urbanization, and modernity. They will know, however, that not all of the city's religionists were either Protestants, Catholics, or Jews. Scholars who follow Butler will also now know that for New Yorkers, there was no understanding of religion outside the practice of that religion. Butler will be charged with New York exceptionalism, however. Most of us who work on New York City eventually are. But what some call New York exceptionalism, others of us simply call urban history. And New York's importance to American religious history can hardly be overstated. One does wish, however, that it were not so easy to conflate Manhattan with New York. One is part of the other, but they are not one and the same. Also, future studies on religion in Gotham should give greater air to the existing and powerful counter narratives to the outdated depictions of the city as especially sinful and immoral, allowing the counter narratives to become the narrative. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. likely had that counter narrative in mind when he said in 1970, Christ would have walked in Selma, he would have marched on Washington, and he would have lived in Harlem. Powell, like many others, already saw the city as moral space, as sacred space. For them, heaven is a city, perhaps New York City. Thank you.
Excellent. I will turn it over to Deborah Dashmore.
Okay, I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here, and it's so great to hear what Wallace had to say, because I can see we're all reading this book from slightly different perspectives, but ones that also overlap. So God in Gotham issues a challenge. If religion can survive, nay, thrive, in Sodom by the sea, then maybe we need to revise our theory of secularization of the modern world. The book's subtitle articulates its subversive claims, The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan. Its alliterative argument suggests a measure of wonder, one of those features of pre-modern life supposedly banished by secularization and the disenchantment of the world. John Butler takes on the theorists as a historian of religion. He is persuasive. He marshals an extraordinary array of evidence from architecture to theology, all of it grounded in New York's lived realities from the 1880s through the 1950s. Understanding those religious realities requires a prodigious grasp of processes of social change because New York City was undergoing rapid growth and modernization. During these years, it expanded from a large city of over 3 million to a huge city of almost 8 million. Manhattan's population, however, hovered around 2 million. In those years, New York secured its reputation as a world city. Its Manhattan skyline of towering skyscrapers overshadowed the city's many church steeples. At the same time, New York became a city without a majority population, a city divided unequally among 3 major religious groups: Catholics, Jews, and Protestants, fissured by ethnicity, class, and race. Jews were the largest ethnic group in the city by 1920, while Catholics were the largest religious group in the city. I want to focus first on one of the microhistories that opens his chapters. Chapter 3 begins with the provocative statement, I know a synagogue that was once a saloon. Talk about sacralizing the urban landscape. But Butler's account of the impact of prohibition, a religiously promoted political accomplishment, on the cityscape emphasizes the fluidity of its spaces. Sacredness did not necessarily adhere only to prescribed buildings set aside as churches or synagogues, but could be found in many varied spaces. This vignette sets the stage for a lively tour of Manhattan Island's streets, pausing at diverse types of religious buildings, many of them extraordinarily innovative, like the Calvary Baptist Church's skyscraper church and residential hotel in Midtown across from Carnegie Hall, And I have to add that we put up our out-of-town guests in this. It was a very reasonably priced hotel when my younger son got married 20 years ago. Even as he notes, the creative structures that respond to pressures of Manhattan real estate, Butler does not lose sight of the constant exchanges of sacred spaces. Synagogues sell their buildings to African-American churches. Churches sell their buildings to synagogues. Nor does he forget the aptly named religious rental market. Everyone rented in Manhattan, except the very wealthy, so it made good sense for religious groups to rent rooms as well. Butler goes on to look at media as a kind of meta space. He recognizes the power of technology to allow religious sentiment to permeate public and private spaces. Listening to recordings of gospel music or radio sermons or cantorial chants brought religion into the lives of many who would not have bothered with organized religion. This view is expansive. Let me now shift to an aspect of God in Gotham that I found particularly rewarding. Butler's approach to religion, his recognition of its multiple dimensions and modes of expression, prompts a reader to rethink widespread assumptions. One of those assumptions regarding New York Jews, for example, is their general lack of religious concern, their secularization. Jewish immigrants seem to have jettisoned much of their religious baggage crossing the ocean, most especially Sabbath observance, a vital feature of Jewish personal and public life. Butler's approach, however, while not directly challenging this fact, suggests that we would do well to look elsewhere for religion, not just in continuities with the old world. For example, his first chapter begins with the painter Joseph Stella. Here, Butler describes how Stella, and I quote, embraced an unapologetic transcendental urbanism, close quote. This vision of Stella's paintings spurred me to think of the Jewish painter Florine Stettheimer and her magnificent series of 4 cathedral paintings that transform Broadway, Wall Street, Fifth Avenue, and art into vibrant images. And do you think we could share a screen so people could see those? Great, okay. That's really nice. Okay. Usually, these are described as secular shrines, but they might also be reinterpreted as expressions of transcendental urbanism. Stettheimer, like Stella, demonstrated in Butler's words the numinous potentialities of modern American urbanism. God in Gotham inspires rethinking previous interpretations of New York Jewish culture. Butler expands our understanding of religion, not through theorizing, but through the power of lived religion. Although God in Gotham does not claim to be comprehensive, its compelling choices invite readers to bring their own examples into the mix. Stettheimer, for example, introduces issues of sexuality. She lived with her mother and sisters in an Upper West Side Manhattan apartment, and in the interwar decades held a regular salon that openly welcomed lesbians, gay, and bisexual men and women, despite legal strictures against open homosexuality in New York. I am tempted to contemplate a reconsideration of her salon, recognizing its power of social acceptance as possessing an element of religious validation of personhood. God in Gotham invites readers to ponder not just religion's staying power, but also the creativity it engenders. We don't need to see the picture anymore, thanks. As the purview of what scholars understand as religious expands to embrace many features of daily living, for example, purchasing food on Thursday afternoon for the Friday night meal and Saturday Sabbath when thinking about Judaism, so do possibilities of comprehending religion's ongoing relevance in the modern world. Butler's attention to the nuances of expression and practice, alongside more typical articulations of belief and belonging, introduces a rich vocabulary of religion. Sacralizing the cityscape involved not just all of those examples of architecture or even the media versions of religious expression, but also lively debates over public schools and release time for religious instruction. Butler manages, in short, to bring together features of modernity that are usually separated. Who considers recorded sermons or religious music together with legal struggles over release time? The Miracle of Religion in Modern Manhattan successfully introduces that sense of wonder that undergirds religious postures in the world and reminds readers of its pervasive presence in belligerently urban New York City. I'm done, John.
All right. Tom, you're on now. Thank you.
John Butler's richly documented and carefully argued history of religion in Manhattan from 1880 to 1960 hopes to explain why religion didn't collapse in modernity's grasp, as religion theorists like Max Weber and William James predicted. And there's much to praise in this wonderful book. I love John and I love this book. That should be clear soon. And it's not only a wonderful book because it will stand as the best religious history of Manhattan, although it will, but it also advances the study of urban religious history by reminding scholars to situate local analysis in a wider and longer context. John gestures to colonial and earlier national history and also notes the transatlantic context. That transatlantic gaze generates historical insights, as when he explains why Protestants struggled to respond to the pluralism they confronted. It was because, he said, the London models they emulated had been developed for a city where foreign-born residents barely numbered 2% of the population. I just hadn't thought of that. The book's methodological approach and regional focus also has implications for how we narrate US religious history. Butler attends to churches while moving beyond a narrowly ecclesiastical focus. He considers institutional authority, a theme he announced as early as his 1991 essay, Historiographical Heresy, but also reaches beyond worship spaces to consider cultural expressions. His attention to religious architecture is a major strength of the book. God in Gotham also offers a rich analysis of how multisensorial religion is mediated by transportation and communication technology. As phonographs conveyed recordings by gospel singer Sister Rosetta Tharpe, and as in that example, Butler describes a wide range of African-American religious practice, and as Wallace suggested, is especially illuminating on the role of storefront churches. Informed readers always have some quarrels about who's included and excluded. I'll leave mine aside. But to Butler's credit, God in Gotham delivers more than it promises by mentioning, for example, Theosophy and Baha'i, as well as the Ethical Cultural Society and the Nation of Islam. He even notes the influence of Peel's positive thinking on President Donald Trump. In fact, its documenting of spiritual diversity is one of the book's many strengths. John's reflection on theory is an especially notable contribution. His 2006 article, Theory and God in Gotham, challenged historians to consider theory and aim for explanation. I'm quoting him. Without self-consciously reimagining the relationship of religion to modernity, he said, our histories of religion will become aimless chronicles that never assess cause or context. That essay challenged historians' resistance to theorizing. In turn, God in Gotham engages theory, and for that, we're once again in John's debt. As a modest down payment, or at least I think it is, on that debt, let me end by reflecting on Butler's use of the terms Religion and Modernity, as well as his explanation of religious persistence. His explanation, as I understand it, John will correct me, is that religion persists because Manhattanites embraced the, quote, instruments of modernity. And I think that's a really suggestive, but perhaps incomplete explanation. And his extraordinary historical evidence might have been put to fuller use if he had borrowed or crafted his own definitions of religion and modernity, and more explicitly noted how this case study advances our understanding of each interpretive category. And by the way, I think it does. In his analysis of Billy Graham's 1957 Yankee Stadium service, Butler suggests that modernity had become religion's engine. I love that. But if modernity propelled religion, I wonder if the relationship went the other way. Was religion modernity's engine? To answer that question and assess his explanation of why religion didn't collapse in modernity's grasp, I think it might help to have more clarity about both modernity and religion. He might have offered an empirical definition of religion at the end, excuse me, in the conclusion, or a stipulative definition at the start, as James did in the Varieties of Religious Experience, saying that for the purposes of this book, he takes religion to mean this or that. Since I'm not sure his explanation tells us all that we want to know. Why did religion flourish in this US city and not in other European centers? Weren't the instruments of modernity available in both? And don't we need to know more about individual motives? Why New Yorkers affiliated with local religious institutions? And which social forces help those institutions flourish? In other words, didn't a vibrant religion have to provide individuals with some satisfying experience, an encounter of supernatural beings or forces, which Butler describes as a traditional substantive definition? Didn't religion's flourishing also depend on how it functioned? For example, by providing city dwellers a sense of belonging. Or John might have borrowed a definition, perhaps Spiro's, which he cites. Spiro said, religion is an institution consisting of culturally patterned interaction with culturally postulated superhuman beings. Since Butler criticizes James and Weber for failing to see the significance of institutions, this definition seems well suited to John's project. And Spiro's phrase about culturally patterned interactions would allow him to consider architecture, technology, and media. I have no vested interest in suggesting that definition. I just wonder if a bit more attention to what religion is and how it functions might have enriched his suggestive explanation of religion's endurance. Finally, I wonder if John might have proposed a definition of modernity while distinguishing the term from modern, modernist, and modernization, and indicating how his study advances our theorizing of the term. And again, I think it does. God in Gotham documents how Protestants, Catholics, and Jews responded to the social conditions of modernity. And although he doesn't use the phrase, Butler shows that in Manhattan, between 1880 and 1960, there were multiple modernities, including Jewish modernities and Catholic modernities. Most important, John's illuminating sources and insightful interpretations offer historical evidence for sociologists who've argued that the defining feature of modernity is not secularity, but pluralism. That, in the end, is one of the most important lessons of Butler's tale. Religion in Gotham was above all diverse. Thanks.
Thanks to all our panelists for just terrific comments. And now John Butler.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank, I've got so many people to thank, but I'll start with Ann Waltner and the Minnesota History Department. It's my home department, all right? It's where I earned my BA. I was a farm town kid, and I came to the U, as it's called in Minnesota. There was at one time only one. And Now everything is a you, but in any case, I love that. I want to thank the American Society of Church History for putting this together, Clayton Jelenic for doing all the mechanical and technological things. I want to thank John McGreevy and Wallace and Deborah and Tom for such a great panel. And yes, I want to thank them for all their really warm comments. So I didn't have my hide taken off. So that's good. So at my stage, that's even better. And whatever. I just want to thank you, Michael, and all the people in the audience. I've scanned the audience, and I know there are many people that I know, and thanks a lot for tuning in, as they say. I just want to say a couple of things about the book, and then a little bit about the comments. The book came out of three things. One, it came out of an intellectual problem. That is, in teaching modern American history, which I did in New Haven for 27 years, I discovered that after you get past 1920, how do you go in that story from the 1920s to Jerry Falwell? No, there wasn't a persuasive explanation. And I thought something's wrong there. And I also thought something is wrong because the subject sort of dissipates until you come to Jerry Falwell or maybe Martin Luther King, put the two together. That's good. The second is that the book wouldn't ever have happened without my late and wonderful friend, Eric Munkinen, with whom I went to graduate school at Minnesota. Then, and we happened to have spouses who were college roommates. And we lived in Minneapolis all summer for decades and shepherded our boys to swimming pools and basketball camps and talked history and mainly urban history. It's where I learned urban history from Eric. And Eric sadly died in 2005, and I miss him enormously still. But without him, I would never, ever have tackled this book. I was trained as a colonialist, after all. I was not trained as a 20th century historian, but I learned it all from Eric. And lastly, I'm a farm town kid who was always enamored of New York City, especially after our 1958 senior class trip went not only to Washington, D.C., but to New York City. And we stayed in the rather already rundown Roosevelt Hotel. And all wish that we could have seen West Side Story, which was in its first year of playing that time. But we did eat at Tad's Steakhouse in Times Square and thought we were sampling the finest of New York City cuisine. And I just learned, by the way, that Tad's Steakhouse just closed this January. So I'm sorry that that's the case. So many nice things said, but issues of some issues. One is that this book was supposed to have at least 2 more chapters, according to my plan, that Harvard Press thought they were buying into. It was supposed to have a chapter on bigotry, and it was supposed to have a chapter on religion and politics. Well, 2 things intervened. One is, at my stage, I discovered I didn't have, who knew whether I was going to finish the book if I had to add those 2 chapters and really do all the research for it that it would require. I wasn't, those were the 2 weakest areas of my research. And secondly, I really wanted a book that just concentrated on this issue of modernity. I did not want to write a narrative history of religion in Manhattan. The book leaves out 10 million things. And I'm reminded of that by all my critics here who mentioned names. For example, Florian Strattheimer. I admit, Deborah, that I had never heard of her. There's so many other things. For Wallace, I missed Adam Clayton Powell Jr.'s piece from which you quoted. I had to go and look it up myself. Well, and Tom, I mean, what can I say about all the various theories of religion that I admit I rather casually passed by. So that's all true. I do want to take up the issue that Tom raised, and that is the issue of maybe I should have adopted both the theory of modernity and the theory of religion and then applied that more systematically to Manhattan. So 2 things. One is just over the last several days, watching Fran Lebowitz's Netflix series pretend it's a city reminded me to think, oh, I should have just called Leibowitz up because she's the best theorist of the city, I can tell you that I know. Put it this way, she's the funniest, okay? If you can take all, 5 hours of one-liners, okay, but I can, so that's fine. I didn't do that. One is because the more I worked on this, the more impoverished I felt as someone who could articulate a theory of religion. I'm a historian, and I admit I like facts. And theorists are theorists. And is it wrong to say, am I wrong to say that they don't like facts? I'm not sure about that. But this group isn't the American Academy of Religion, so I can probably get away with saying that, okay? But in any case, I just felt increasingly impoverished. And that's why I continuously shortened the little section in the introduction to the book, the sections on religious theory and modernity. What was the theory of modernity got shorter and shorter. And they got shorter and shorter the more I worked on the book, because I just thought, I just am not equipped to do that. That's not what I do. I need to let other people do that. And I'm serious about, at one point I said, there's so much more to say. And this is the kind of book that I hope introduces people to the subject. I hope it introduces people to the fact that something really important went on in as unlikely, as unspiritual a place as Manhattan seemed to be between roughly 1910 and the 1960s. And if it dissipated afterwards, well, that's the nice thing about being a historian. You just say, well, that's what I'm quitting. I'm not discussing contemporary American religion. That's not my thing. I'm not a sociologist of religion, et cetera. So that's not what I do. The nice thing about being a historian is one is that you get all your subjects dead and they can't talk back to you. And the second thing is that you really can just run with that, and leave it there, and let the contemporary world, our miserable contemporary world, take care of itself. And in that regard, I think since historians make such poor prophets, I did say something about the future of religion in the last 3 paragraphs or something of the book at one last section. I can only say that I don't know a single historian. If you think of what historian in 2000 would have predicted and did predict that we would ever have had a Black president, much less Donald Trump as the president of the United States, I don't know one. And so I'm not going to be pretending that that's for me. So thanks a lot for tuning in. And maybe people in the audience will have questions and John can dream them up.
I will take the prerogative of asking the first question, but that's mostly to give you a minute to send things on the chat. You can send them to me directly, which is fine, or I guess send to the group too. And like I said, I'll try and consolidate a couple of the questions. I'm sure there are a lot on people's mind. So ponder those as I ask John 2 questions. First, how would you answer what I took to be Tom's little bit of challenge, which is religion didn't, I'm putting this in my own words, religion didn't flourish in the same way as it did in, let's say, Paris or London, as it did in New York City. And yet those cities experienced modernity as well. How do we understand that?
So my answer to that is in good part, the vigor of the immigrant experience and the ability of religion to reconstitute itself as an answer to the issue of meaning for people who have just moved from old world, in this case, old world countries to the new world, and are trying to piece their worlds back together. And the Protestant, if I may say, the old line Protestant response to that, which oftentimes was frankly ugly, but also helped reconstitute Protestantism itself, in part as a response to both Catholicism and to Judaism in New York City. But part of that is an inadequate answer, because I think it's also true that there were cities without the notable ethnic mix and religious mix of Manhattan in particular, where religion seems to have prospered very well in Atlanta, Cincinnati, Omaha, St. Louis, Kansas City. All of them had ethnic mixes, but nothing approached New York. Nothing like it. So my answer is not really a very helpful one, I think, but it's the answer that I can give. Well, I'll add one other thing. The classic issue of, in America, religion is on its own and it has to reinvent itself. It doesn't get help from the state. And so I think that seems to be a real problem in Europe, where organized religion was always established in some form, and it was almost always taken to be the religion of the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. And that's generally suppressed, except for Catholic immigrants coming to London. It generally, who reconstituted their own Catholicism as well as their ethnic experience as minorities. But London was not a great place for a vibrant urban religiosity.
Okay, excellent. We have a question from Tom Kesselman, also my colleague at Notre Dame. And he says, I'd love to hear John talk about the denominational focus in his book and the importance he attributes to institutions. The institutions seem to follow parallel tracks, Tom says, but they don't really interact. How aware were Jews, Protestants, and Catholics aware of each other's work and ideas? This seems to change somewhat by the mid-20th century. People like Reinhold Niebuhr knew people from other traditions, but is there a development over time of crossing religious boundaries?
I think that, I have two thoughts about that. One is that in terms of intellectuals / theologians, there doesn't seem to be a lot of awareness across the traditions until we come up to the 1940s. I would say the 30s and the 40s. But before that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, that's my sense. Mm-hmm. You don't get a lot of talk about it, and but you do begin to get it in the 30s and the 40s, and part of it has to do with Manhattan. Part of it has to do with, powerful intellectuals. I mean, Catholics and Jews knew that there was something going on at Union Theological Seminary. And pretty soon, people at Union Theological Seminary, especially in the 40s and 50s, realized there's something going on at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Mm-hmm. And then individual Catholics, I can't say that the seminary north of the city was a great player in this, but individual Dorothy Day knew well what was going on in at least some aspects of Protestant and Jewish theological life. And figures like Jacques Maritain, of course, I use him in a chapter. He's in exile in the city for 4.5 years, but he plunges because he began a tour of America just before the Germans invaded France, and then he was stuck in the city. But he plunged into the intellectual and theological life in the city, especially at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Yeah. And so that I think that happens. Institutionally, let's talk about institutions. I think there's very little knowledge, cross-fertilization among the traditions, the three powerful big time traditions. They seem all to have gone their own way, very much their own way. Catholics really were hierarchical. And you can see that in their parish structure. You could say they're the ones who built these giant sanctuaries for extremely large parishes with 3,000 to 7,000 members in the parish, communicants who would go there. Protestants all maintained rather small congregations, except for very wealthy ones, except for a few wealthy ones. Okay, and Jews didn't organize centrally, but they in part built on wealth. They built prominent sanctuaries. But the interesting thing about the one thing that ties them all together, though they didn't know it, is they all became experts in real estate management. They all could have passed, every one of them could have passed a real estate license for the city. I'm assuming there were exams in the 20s and 30s, maybe there weren't, but they all could have passed, and they all were experts in financing buildings. Absolutely. And that's the one thing that they did share. But though they didn't talk, as far as I know, they didn't talk with each other about it. Jews didn't ask Protestants how they financed their buildings, and Protestants didn't ask Catholics. And well, Protestants thought they knew how Catholics did it, but they're probably wrong, and et cetera. So on that level, there wasn't a lot of interchange.
Excellent. Deborah and Wallace, does John's story of relatively little interaction at the intellectual level until the mid 20th century run true to your, very deep knowledge of religion in New York City?
I'll jump in there first really quickly, if Deborah doesn't mind, because I was taking notes as John was speaking there, because that's absolutely the case. I'm finding that, and I started with a question. I went out several months ago trying to find all the modernists I could find, the theological modernists, and I had an assumption that there was a lot of interchange or exchange between the modernists in Harlem and those in Lower Manhattan. What I found was there was not. There was not that kind of interchange at all. Every now and then you will see maybe Harry Emerson Fosdick maybe gave a little speech, some Harlem church or something like that. Adam Clayton Powell went downtown and gave us sermons. But in terms of real vibrant a union and a sense of collectivity across denominations, and racial cooperation in that regard, I did not see that. And I have some theories why. New York, the very, very plural nature of New York, the religion's vibrancy in New York, ironically enough, from what I can see, didn't actually promote that kind of interracial, intradenominational or interdenominational cooperation. Let's not underestimate the power of competition among these denominations and these churches. Particularly, John mentioned architecture. All of the churches in Harlem that constructed elaborate churches, right? And they did so in direct competition to other ones, more and more elaborate churches. Some of them modeling those churches by churches in Lower Manhattan. And so there's competition. The whole city is wide open. So in some ironic way, it's so dynamic in New York that it's not actually promoting the type of vibrant cooperation that you would expect in a place like New York. So in some way, I understand. So I didn't find that union and that unity and that search for union. But in the 1950s, though, with a kind of a greater effort, 40s and 50s, kind of greater efforts for church exchange and interreligious dialogue does begin to happen. But I think those efforts were frustrated in the early years by churches just merely trying to exist on their own.
That's fascinating. Deborah, what would your reaction be?
So I think there's a difference between the synagogues and as institutional buildings and intellectual exchange. Synagogues did look to the Protestant institutional church, as it was called, for the ways in which it had multiple activities under its auspices. And they even borrowed the name, the institutional synagogue, for example, with Wise. So there was some exchange, well, exchange is the wrong word. There was some borrowing of ideas of how one could create a synagogue that was more than just a place for men to worship. Right? Because that really was the problem for Jewish synagogues. Synagogues were male spaces, and you get the transformation of these spaces to include women, to include children who were being educated to it, right? So that's a big change, and Jews look to Protestants in that regard. I think actually, in terms of the intellectuals, John's largely right, but that you don't talk about Columbia. And Columbia is a place where people like Dewey have an enormous impact on Jewish thinkers. And there is a kind of exchange through Columbia University that takes place prior to, I mean, really in the period of around World War I and the very early 1920s.
Okay, great. There's a question from James Oberly from Eau Claire, who says, I once did a study of Manhattan weddings in the first decade of the 20th century, tracking weddings in churches versus civil weddings. I was struck to find that the Episcopalian little church around the corner at 29th and 5th Avenue was the scene of more church weddings than any other church in Manhattan. And many of the grooms and brides had jobs in the theater and music hall business. How did the continuing popularity of the ceremonial aspect of churches, in this case, weddings at the little church of theater people, how does that play into your theme of modernity in Manhattan?
If I'm going to answer the question, I'll say it's the little church around the corner, of course, was literally a marketing strategy. That is even the name, it's informal. It's that name was a marketing ploy. And it helps explain why. And apparently, I didn't realize. So I'm glad to know about the weddings. I wish I had known about that before. Jim lives around the corner from me, so I should have gone around the corner and asked him about this, but I didn't know that. But in any case, it's not surprising to me that congregation was performed so many ways. Moreover, it was the congregation that did appeal to show business people. And who likes show better than show business people? I mean, who wants a showy wedding better than, pardon me for, for implicitly demeaning the spiritual nature of a marriage ceremony, but there's a nice show part to it, and show business people, I think, probably would like that. So I think that alone helps explain why that congregation would have such an active role in performing weddings in the city.
Okay. I don't see other questions in my chat. Clayton, you'll let me know when they come in. I want to ask a question to our panel, and I want to kind of put John a little bit on the spot. John said, hey, don't bother me with post-1960. I'm a historian. But if we were looking 1980 to 2020, I haven't looked at the data recently, but I'm sure we would see massive decline in adherence in almost every religious group you look at. And by that, I mean mainline Protestants, white mainline Protestants, African-American Christians, certainly Roman Catholics, Reform and conservative Jews. There are exceptions to that generalization, but you would see massive decline in the standard indicators of religious adherence, religious loyalty from the peak of 1960, contrasted with 1980 to 2020. So maybe first you, John, and then other people on our panel could jump in. Doesn't that startling fact have some consequences for a study that says modernity propelled religion? The startling fact being religious adherence in Manhattan declined significantly between 1980 to 2020, and I'm going to be generalized here, almost unequivocally.
So first of all, I completely agree with you. You're totally right about the numbers. Congregations are closing. You know, look at what happened to Catholicism in the city. Schools are, you know, Catholic schools, traditional Catholic schools are just collapsing almost literally by the minute. The bishops are just, archbishops are just scurrying to try to keep bolster up some of them to stay open. You know, synagogues are having problems. Everybody's, all the mainline groups. So I say that, first of all, I suppose I could be a smart aleck and say, well, you know, here, this is post-modernity. So I can't explain, we're in the post-modern period, not in the modern period, okay? Don't ask me to explain that, but that's what I might say. Then I would also say that in summary, who's prospering? Well, if you look at a number of websites in the city, there's one, now I'm embarrassed to say that I've forgotten its name. It's called a tour of New York City religions or something like that. There's a website, and where is organized faith prospering among immigrant groups? That is overwhelmingly among the relatively recently arrived immigrant groups, which is sort of a replication of what happened between 1880 and the 1930s and 40s. So then, of course, we're in a quite different period. And one of the reasons that I'd say it's, depending on how you want to define modernity, we also have the rise of the internet, especially after 1990. And I think my own view, and then here is where I'll just be an amateur sociologist of religion. My own view is that is transforming the nature of religious observance and views and beliefs far more profoundly than we may really realize yet. I think there's a clear impact that the internet is having on the nature of faith, if I could put it that way, and the way it's organized and the way you express it. And it's leading to, on the one hand, a fissuring of responses. Everybody can have their own faith, and the internet will provide every conceivable response that you would like to which you might want to make. You can certainly find it. And if you can't find it today, you can find it tomorrow. So tomorrow morning, if it's not there today, it's there, it'll be there tomorrow morning. Someone will have put up a new website for you. So there you have it. And you know, that didn't happen in the 1890s. It might have seemed like it was happening, but not at the scale that it's blossoming in the 21st century.
Tom Tweed, is John's answer compelling for you?
I like everything John says, yes.
Okay.
I think I would have said maybe there's something about the post-modernity part of the answer and the pointing to immigrants. I guess what I would say is I always think there's economic and social, so I get too complicated, but a couple of things shift. And I would just say it's a shift from a kind of a mistrust, which is Watergate and the oil crisis and Roe v. Wade, an institutional mistrust, which a corrosion of trust in institutions generally that happened somewhere in the 70s, along with a whole shift to a service economy and information. There's a whole bunch of things going on where I think institutional religion begins to decline in some ways. I don't think religion, broadly conceived, outside of institutions has the same plummeting. And I think, John, you make a really good point about new immigrants. So when we start to feel the presence of the 1965 Immigration Act, which is really not then, by the 1990s, it's really starting to be felt. They're going to churches. They look like folks in 1880. And I would, if I was picking a place, I would have written about Brooklyn, not Manhattan, by the way. Because I think it's a better case study of 1880 to say 1940, because its immigrants are really vital there. So I think you still find the significance of that among immigrants, but you find a non-institutional spiritual but not religious piety. So if you counted Christian booksellers things, Thich Nhat Hanh books about meditation in Manhattan, and this starts, as you know, John, this was my only small suggestion about other people to throw in. D.T. Suzuki is talking in Colombia in the 1950s and transforming the art scene. Being everybody, psychologists, painters, poets are all transformed, and not much of what they're doing counts as religion, but it certainly arises from it. So I would say non-institutional religion begins to decline in some ways among some institutions, but on the right and the left, it's as vibrant as ever.
Okay. Wallace, how would you solve this puzzle?
Well, let me jump in there by saying, first of all, I think I'm currently thinking and writing a lot about Harlem these days. So I think Harlem is an exception here. Harlem is basically in crisis from the 1960s throughout the 80s and into the 90s. Unemployment high, mortality rates are high. The whole place is in crisis. But you don't see, and I'm a little bit out on a limb here, because I do stop my own study very early on. I don't go into that period, but from what I already know from my research, religion, and certainly not churches, are in crisis or in decline throughout that period. In fact, they were thriving. In 1930, Abyssinian Baptist Church has 8,000 people. It remains the largest church in Harlem throughout that time of crisis. It's actually even growing. It's actually becoming quite wealthy throughout that, buying up all of that dilapidated property around there. And so it depends on where you look. Religion by no means declines, even against sort of like national trends. What I see in Harlem, even though it's in crisis, religions proliferate and churches continue to grow. The largest churches, for instance, continue to be the largest churches. They continue to buy property. They continue to maintain their prominence in these communities. So, so in some ways, even when there is depopulation happening, so a lot of if one would see shifts or downward trends, it would be due to depopulation. It would be due to the economy, for instance. And so people moving out of Harlem, further out into New York and to New Jersey and so forth and so on. So I think Harlem is a counter narrative to that, even that downward trend. Somebody else is gonna have to do that, because I'm not gonna take my study into the 1980s. But from what I can see already, I don't see institutions declining in the way that in religious institutions declining in the way that the rest of the neighborhood is actually.
Excellent. Deborah.
So a couple of points. First of all, New York attracts a very large and growing population of Hasidic Jews, mostly in Brooklyn, but not completely. And this is an exploding population, and it is religious in its behaviors in a variety of ways. Not big synagogues, because that's not what they worship in, right? We're back to men worshiping in synagogues are male spaces. At the same time, starting in the late 60s and 70s especially, you get the explosion of feminist activism. And that has an enormous impact on religion in Manhattan. You have religious figures, women who become rabbis, you have intellectuals, you have political engagement. And it leads also to the rise of gay and lesbian synagogues and the diversification of Jewish religious life. So I'm not somebody who would buy the decline, except to the extent, as Wallace pointed out, that if you have a declining population, if you go from 2 million Jews, in the city in 1950 down to under a million in 2000, it's logical to expect that you're not going to be able to support as many institutions. The numbers start to go up again in the 21st century. So I think that the declining population is really key, at least in the Jewish piece. And I would say, yes, immigrants, they were key back then in the early part of the 20th century, and they're key now in the at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, with incredible religious diversity in Manhattan, but also in Flushing and Queens, and in a whole variety of places. So I'm less willing to buy a decline narrative, except to the extent that it rests upon those population groups that have shrunk within the city. It's a different city in 2020 today, or well, we're in 2021, whatever, than it was in 1960. And therefore, there's no reason to expect it to look the same. One of the things I love about your book, John, is the ways in which you push us to think creatively about religion and where we will find it. Some of the things you didn't talk about street festivals, and but I mean, there's lots of places where you can find it still flourishing in the city, even if it's not in large edifices.
Okay. Terrific responses. Tom?
If I could just add one thing to that, I thought my colleagues were great on that. The only thing I would say, if we to pull back to global, what you see, say for in the 70s, this is me disagreeing with me, which I do often, but there's a kind of there's a resurgence of an assertive religion globally. So the moral majority happens the same year as the Iranian Revolution. So if you're looking around the world, there's a certain kind of retaking and asserting claims in civic space all over the place. And there's examples of this among Buddhists and Hindus and Muslims and evangelical Protestants and other kinds of things. If, like John McGreevy, if you're thinking about Catholic churches in cities, that's just a story of decline after the peaks of the 60s, where nuns and parochial schools go down. But globally, there's a kind of resurgence, is the language that some political scientists would use, of an assertive public square religion. And that's part of, so religion moves to other spaces, to outside of traditional institutional things, into new kinds of things, and back into exactly the place that nobody thought they were going to go, into the middle of the public square.
John, do you have any final comments, reflections?
Well, I do. One is, I can tell you, I mean, every person in this who's watching knows what I'm going to say now. And that is, thank God I'm done with the book. All right. So I'm so glad that I finished the book. And it's done, it's out of here, and I can't I can't do anything about it anymore. So that's good. I can't, I was so used to picking with it that, and I love the research. That's one of the reasons it took me so much longer to write than I thought it was going to. I just liked the research part. I mean, of course, research, I've always said to my own students, that they've heard this, and that is that you always have a good day researching, but you never have a good day writing. So you always find something interesting in your research. It's rare that you have a day in which you don't find something interesting. Whether it has anything to do with the project you're working on is another matter. But you find something interesting, in fact, oftentimes something intriguing that you then spend too much time on, and then, whatever. So that's right. So the writing, I mean, I'm not a tortured writer, but I pick too much. And I also want to say that I had a great help from Harvard Press. I want to say that, and I had a wonderful copy editor. So you don't learn that sometimes people don't value. I know I occasionally would run it when I was a department chair or a dean, put it this way, I would run into colleagues who complained about their copy editors. And then I mean, I have to say this, and then when I read the book, I thought, oh, I wish you had paid a little bit more attention to the copy editor. So that would have been helpful. That would have been a good thing. So I think copy editors sort of bring you down a little bit, but they also lift you up. They also tell you how to do a better job in explaining something without sacrificing a thing. They really do help when they're good. So I did, and then I also want to say that I'm very proud, by the way, and I'm going to show this. I'm very proud of the cover. Yeah. Okay, so the book has. I'm going to say myself, the book has a gorgeous cover. The cover, it's a Berenice Abbott, is that her name? I've forgotten the photographer's name.
Yeah.
I'm having a senior moment here.
Yeah, it's Bernice Abbott.
It's Bernice Abbott's
yes.
famous photograph, Night View, which she did in 1932. Reputedly by hanging off one of the skyscraper New York building to take this photograph. So, and the genius designers at Harvard Press, first of all, worked out the copyright problems. And secondly, they turned a photograph into a cover. And I'm deeply appreciative of what they did. I think the press did a really nice job with the book. So I'm glad to be done. I'm glad people find it worthwhile to read. I did enjoy writing it, and I do want to say that I really had fun in the end, not always in the middle, but in the end, especially writing the introduction to chapters. I've always found that fun to do, to try to deal with a vignette in some way that helps readers, that tells a little compelling little story, and then gets readers into the subjects. And it just was fun to do. So now I sit around and look at the snow and what am I going to do next? And I do have a little project, over at the Minnesota Historical Society, but they're closed, so who knows when they'll open, and all that kind of stuff. So I'm just grateful. I've known such wonderful people in my career, and a number of them are there. First of all, the panel, and then secondly, I really, from the time I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, sitting on the floor of then Wilson Library reading English documents, because I had to take a what was then called a seminar in Tudor Stuart history. And I thought, oh, well, this is, maybe this will work out. Maybe this history business is really something that you could do. And I had wonderful jobs. So I taught at Cal State Bakersfield. Not everybody who ends up at a fancy place starts at Cal State Bakersfield, but I had a wonderful job for 4 years. And then at the University of Illinois at Chicago, then called Chicago Circle. I like that name better, but anyway, it's now called the University of Illinois Chicago. And then in New Haven. And I had wonderful students and wonderful friends. So what more could you ask for?
What a beautiful way to end. Let's give a virtual round of applause to our panelists and to John Butler for writing such a wonderful book. And I'm going to pass it over to Ann Waltner.
Thank you. I guess I have two things to say before I do my brief informal formal close. First is, John, every last one of us wants the name of your copy editor. And the second thing is, someone just posted on the chat that the Minnesota Historical Society will be open again in the next week or so. So you will maybe be in a position where you can find more intriguing tidbits as well as things that will further your next research project, which we'll have to have another event to hear about. I would like to thank everyone who participated. John, both Johns and all of the panelists, and also the visitors. And also I really want to thank Andrea Stirk, whose idea it was to bring this this conversation to this venue. I think this is I just want to thank everybody. I'm not going to read the whole list of future events to you, but I can't resist reading the next three. On February 10th, we will be talking with Joe Trotter about his book, Workers on Arrival, Black Labor in the Making of America. And he will be in conversation with our colleague, Will Jones. On March 24th, we'll be talking about Kirsten Fisher's book with Kirsten Fisher. The book is American Freethinker, Elihu Palmer, and the Struggle for Religious Freedom in the New Nation. And on April 21st, Alan Isaacman will present his book, Mozambique, Samora Michel, A Life Cut Short. And we actually, I think we're booked all the way through to September. We have sort of defined our community as faculty, former graduate students, and I'm glad you pointed out that John is in fact, among everything else he is a former graduate student at the University of Minnesota. So we have kind of infinite richness to draw on. So with that, I would like to thank you. Clayton, people will be getting an email with the link to the recording. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. It'll go out later this week or early next week.
I think that if you sign up for one of our events, that means unless you explicitly request to be taken off our mailing list, you will get information about all of the rest of the events. So thank you. And I hope you all stay safe in these really complicated and difficult times, and can regard work like this and conversations like this as kind of a place to find solace and peace. So thank you all very much.